The night Bon Scott was found lifeless in a car remains one of rock music's most haunting and misunderstood moments, a dark chapter where legend and reality blur into a single tragic image. As the electrifying frontman of AC/DC, Scott embodied rebellion energy and the raw spirit of rock and roll, living a life that burned as fiercely as the music he created. But on that final night, the same intensity that fueled his rise became part of his downfall, as hours of heavy drinking reportedly led to a silent and irreversible end. Found alone, unresponsive, and far from the stage that defined him, his death was officially ruled as acute alcohol poisoning. But for many, the unanswered details surrounding those final hours continue to echo like an unfinished song. It wasn't just the loss of a singer, it was the sudden silencing of a voice that defined an era, leaving behind a legacy wrapped in both brilliance and tragedy, and a question that lingers even today. What truly happened in those last moments before the music stopped? The night Bon Scott was found lifeless in a car did not begin as a tragedy. It began like so many other nights in the world he knew, filled with noise, energy, and the reckless freedom that defined the era of rock and roll he helped shape. As the unmistakable voice of AC/DC, Scott lived on the edge of intensity, a performer whose presence on stage felt almost unstoppable, as if nothing could silence the force he carried within him. But away from the spotlight, the same lifestyle that fueled his legend was quietly taking its toll, building toward a moment that no one around him could fully see coming. In the hours leading up to that final night, the details blur into a familiar pattern. Drinks shared, laughter exchanged, and the kind of atmosphere that surrounded so many musicians of that time. It was a world where excess was not only accepted but often expected, where pushing limits was part of the identity that defined rock culture. For Bon Scott, this environment was both a source of inspiration and a growing risk, one that followed him long after the music stopped. And on that night, the line between celebration and danger was crossed in a way that would change everything. What makes this story so haunting is not just the outcome, but the quiet stillness that followed. After hours of activity, the night eventually faded into silence, leaving Scott alone in a parked car, a stark contrast to the roaring crowds and flashing lights that had once surrounded him. It was in that silence that tragedy unfolded, unnoticed and irreversible. By the time he was found, the damage had already been done, his life cut short in a moment that seemed almost impossible when measured against the energy he brought to the world. The official cause, acute alcohol poisoning, offers a clinical explanation, a simple statement meant to define what happened. But for those who look deeper, it feels incomplete, because this was not just a medical event. It was the end of a life that had come to symbolize something much larger. Bon Scott was more than a singer. He was a voice that captured the raw, unapologetic spirit of a generation. His lyrics, his presence, and his attitude all reflected a kind of freedom that resonated with millions. And in losing him, that freedom suddenly felt fragile. There's also the lingering question of those final hours, what conversations were had, what decisions were made, and whether anything could have changed the outcome. These questions do not come from a place of accusation, but from a natural human desire to understand. When a life ends so suddenly, especially one so vibrant, it leaves behind a sense of incompleteness, as if the story was interrupted before it could reach its natural conclusion. And in that interruption, speculation begins to grow, filling the gaps left by uncertainty. At the same time, it is important to remember the context of the era. The world of rock music in the late 1970s and early 1980s was defined by extremes, where boundaries were constantly tested and consequences were often overlooked. For many artists, this environment became both a playground and a trap, offering success while quietly demanding a price. Bon Scott's story fits into this larger narrative, one that includes both triumph and tragedy, brilliance and vulnerability. Yet even within this darkness, there's a legacy that refuses to fade. The music of AC/DC continued, evolving in the wake of his loss, carrying forward the energy that Scott helped create. His influence remained embedded in every note, every performance, a reminder of the role he played in shaping something that would endure far beyond his lifetime. It is a legacy built not only on what he achieved, but on the spirit he brought to it, a spirit that could not be extinguished, even in death. As the story stretches further, it becomes less about the exact details of that night and more about what it represents. It is a reflection on the cost of living without limits, on the fine line between passion and self-destruction, and on the way moments can define an entire life. It is also a reminder that behind every legend is a human being, someone who experiences the same vulnerabilities and risks as anyone else, regardless of fame or success. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate, because it is not just about Bon Scott. It is about the nature of ambition, the allure of excess, and the consequences that can follow when those forces collide. It is a story that invites reflection, not only on the life that was lost, but on the choices that shape every life in the end, the image of that night remains powerful. A quiet car, a silent moment, and a life that ended far too soon. But beyond that image is something more enduring. A voice that still echoes, a legacy that still inspires, and a story that continues to remind us of both the brilliance and fragility of those who dare to live at full volume. The story of the night Bon Scott was found lifeless continues to echo through rock history, not because of what is unknown, but because of how suddenly everything stopped. One moment, he was the voice of AC/DC, a performer whose energy seemed unstoppable, whose presence turned chaos into rhythm, and whose personality defined an entire era of hard-driving rock. The next, he was gone, discovered in a parked car after a night that unfolded like so many others in the world he lived in, filled with alcohol, movement, and the blurred boundaries between celebration and excess. What makes this moment so difficult to fully process is the contrast between life and silence. Bon Scott was never a quiet figure in life. Everything about him was loud, expressive, and intensely alive. His voice carried a raw edge that connected directly with audiences, not through polish, but through honesty and force. Yet his final hours ended in complete stillness, a silence so abrupt that it still feels unnatural when measured against the noise he left behind. That contradiction is what keeps his story alive in memory. Not just how he died, but how far it fell from the life he lived and the world surrounding him. Heavy drinking and late-night gatherings were not unusual. They were part of a culture that often blurred responsibility with rebellion. For many musicians of that era, including Scott, the lifestyle was woven into the identity of rock and roll itself. It was a world where limits were constantly tested, where nights stretched long into the early morning, and where consequences were often ignored until they could no longer be avoided. Within that environment, the events leading to his death did not stand out at the time. They only became significant in hindsight. By the time he was discovered, it was already too late. The official explanation of acute alcohol poisoning gave a medical definition to something that felt emotionally far more complex. It reduced a deeply human tragedy into clinical language, but it could not reduce its impact, because what was lost was not just a life. It was a creative force, a personality that had helped shape the sound and attitude of a band that would go on to become one of the most influential in rock history. After his death, AC/DC faced a defining moment. Many bands might have ended under such circumstances, unable to recover from the loss of a frontman so central to their identity. But instead, they carried forward, eventually rebuilding with a new voice while still carrying the imprint of Scott's influence. His presence remained embedded in the band's identity, not as something erased, but as something permanent, an origin point that could never be replaced or repeated. At the same time, the mythology around his final night began to grow. Whenever a life ends suddenly and publicly, especially one belonging to a cultural icon, details tend to expand beyond their factual boundaries. People search for deeper meaning, hidden causes, or alternative explanations, as if understanding more details might somehow make the loss feel less abrupt. In Scott's case, however, the known facts remain relatively consistent, even if interpretations vary. The tragedy lies not in mystery, but in clarity. A life ended too soon in a way that feels all too human. And yet, the emotional weight of the story is not found in speculation. It is found in reflection. Bon Scott's life represents a particular kind of artistic existence, one fueled by intensity, charisma, and unrelenting drive to perform. That same intensity, however, can be consuming. The line between living fully and living unsustainably is often thin, especially in environments where excess is normalized. His story becomes a reminder how easily that line can be crossed without immediate realization. Still, it would be incomplete to define him only by his final moments. His legacy is far greater than the circumstances of his death. Through his work with AC/DC, he helped shape songs that continued to define rock music decades later. His voice remains one of the most recognizable in the genre, and his influence continues to be felt in artists who draw inspiration from his raw, unfiltered style. In many ways, his impact grew even after his passing, as the music he helped create took on a life of its own. There's also something deeply human about the way his story is remembered. It is not just about fame or tragedy, but about the fragility of time. Lives that move at extraordinary speed often leave behind extraordinary echoes, but they also remind us how quickly everything can change. One night can feel like many others, until suddenly it is not. One decision, one moment, one silence can alter everything that follows as time continues to pass. The image of that night remains both simple and heavy. A car, a still figure, and a world that would wake up to the absence of a voice it could not replace. Yet even in that absence, Bon Scott's presence remains remarkably strong. His music continues to play, his influence continues to spread, and his name continues to be spoken not only as part of history, but as part of something still alive. In the end, the story is not only about how he died in that car, but about how fully he lived before reaching it. And perhaps it is why it continues to be told. Not to dwell on the final moment, but to understand the life that made that moment so profoundly significant as the story of that night continues to be retold. It becomes less about the physical location where Bon Scott was found, and more about the emotional weight that surrounds everything he left behind. A parked car on an ordinary street could have been forgotten in any other context, but in his case it became a fixed point in rock history, an ending that feels both sudden and strangely symbolic. Because Scott's life, like his music with AC/DC, was never about stillness. It was about motion, energy, and a kind of controlled chaos that made him unforgettable on stage. To imagine that energy stopping so abruptly is what continues to unsettle fans, even decades later. In the aftermath, those who were close to him were left trying to piece together not just what happened, but how it had come to that point. The hours before his death, often described in fragments and recollections, reflect a familiar rhythm of the rock lifestyle of that time: late nights, drinking, and a sense of invincibility that often masked underlying risk. But even within that environment, no one expected the outcome to be so final. That contrast between expectation and reality is what gives the story its lasting emotional force. It reminds us how easily ordinary moments can become irreversible turning points. What also lingers is the silence that followed. In the world of music, silence is usually temporary. Pauses between songs, breaks between tours, moments before the next performance begins. But this silence was permanent. It did not lead to another show, another recording session, or another return to the stage. Instead, it marked the end of a voice that had become central to the identity of AC/DC during its most formative years. That absence was not just felt by fans, but by the band itself, which suddenly had to confront a future without the man who helped define its sound. The official explanation of acute alcohol poisoning provides medical clarity, but it does little to capture the emotional complexity of what was lost. Because Bon Scott was not simply a vocalist, he was a personality that shaped the tone, attitude, and direction of the music he created. His lyrics carried a mix of humor, rebellion, and honesty that connected with audiences in a direct and unfiltered way. Losing that creative force meant more than losing a performer. It meant losing a specific kind of artistic identity that could never be replicated in quite the same form again. Over time, discussions about that night have often drifted between fact and interpretation. Some focus strictly on confirmed details, while others explore possibilities or speculate about circumstances surrounding the timeline. But beneath all of that exists a more grounded truth. This was a human life shaped by intensity, choices, and an environment that rewarded excess. It is not a story that requires exaggeration to be impactful. Its weight comes from its simplicity. The fact that someone so full of life reached a point where that life ended far too soon. And yet, despite the tragedy, Bon Scott's influence did not end with his passing. Instead, it evolved. The music he helped create with AC/DC continued to grow in reach and power, carrying forward the foundation he helped build. In that sense, his presence remained embedded in the band's identity. Even as it moved into a new chapter, his voice became part of its origin story, something that shaped everything that followed. There's also a broader reflection that emerges from his story, one that extends beyond music. It speaks to the nature of lifestyle balance and the unseen costs that can accompany extreme living. The rock and roll world of that era often celebrated pushing boundaries, but stories like Scott's reveal the fragile edge that existed beneath that celebration. It is not a moral lesson in a simple sense, but rather a reminder that intensity, while powerful, is not without consequence. Still, it would be incomplete to let that one night define him, because when people remember Bon Scott, they do not only remember how he died, they remember how he lived, performed, and connected with audiences around the world. His voice remains instantly recognizable, his performances still influential, and his presence still felt in the DNA of rock music. That lasting impact is what transforms a story from tragedy into legacy. Even now, decades later, the image of that final night remains fixed in cultural memory. But alongside exists a much larger picture, one filled with stages, recordings, and moments of artistic brilliance. And within that larger picture, Bon Scott is not defined by an ending, but by a body of work that continues to resonate in the end. The night he was found in that car is not just a moment of loss. It is a reminder of how quickly life can change, how fragile even the brightest careers can be, and how enduring true artistic influence can become. His story does not close with silence. It continues through every note, every song, and every listener who still hears the voice of a man who lived as loudly as he sang it. Tio go further into the story of that night. What becomes increasingly clear is that the final chapter of Bon Scott's life cannot be separated from the life he lived leading up to it. His world was one of constant movement, touring, recording, performing, and existing in the high-pressure environment of global rock stardom as the frontman of AC/DC. In that world, nights often blurred into mornings, and boundaries between celebration and exhaustion became difficult to distinguish. The culture around him was not unusual for its time, but was intense enough that the risks were always present. Even if they were not always acknowledged as the hours of that final night unfolded, there was no clear indication that it would become historically significant. It followed a pattern familiar to those in his circle: social drinking, conversation, and the kind of atmosphere that surrounded musicians after long periods of work and travel. Nothing in those moments suggested permanence or finality, and yet the transition from life to death happened within that same ordinary flow of time, without warning or dramatic interruption. That sudden shift is part of what makes the story so difficult to fully process even today. When he was later discovered in a parked car, the contrast between who he was in life and the condition in which he was found created an image that has stayed embedded in rock history. The stillness of that moment stands in direct opposition to everything he represented publicly. On stage, he was movement, volume, and presence. In that final setting, there was none of it, only silence. That contrast is not just factual. It is emotional, and it is what continues to give a story its lasting weight. The official explanation, acute alcohol poisoning, provides a clear medical conclusion, but it does not answer every emotional question the event raises. It defines the cause, but not the full human context. And in stories involving public figures, especially those as influential as Scott, people often seek meaning beyond the clinical facts. They look for patterns, warnings, or deeper explanations, as if understanding more could somehow reshape the outcome. But in this case, the simplicity of the cause is part of what makes it so difficult. There is no elaborate mystery required for tragedy to exist. What followed his passing was not just grief, but transformation. For AC/DC, the lost men confronting the future without the voice that had defined their early identity. Few bands survived the death of frontmen at such a crucial stage, yet they continued, carrying forward both the sound they had built and the influence Scott had left behind. His absence became part of their evolution, shaping the direction of their music even as they moved forward with a new chapter. At the same time, the narrative surrounding that night gradually expanded beyond verified details. Over time, stories, interpretations, and theories emerged, each attempting to fill emotional gaps rather than factual ones. This is a common pattern in cultural tragedies involving iconic figures. When information feels incomplete, imagination often steps in. But even without speculation, the core story remains powerful on its own. A life of extraordinary intensity ending suddenly in an ordinary place. It is also worth understanding the broader environment in which this happened. The rock scene of that era was defined by